Roald Dahl wrote books like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory,
Yeah, and everybody's read that.
James and the Giant Peach. Well, they're being scrubbed by sensitivity experts to remove language that is offensive, including words like fat or ugly. Also making the Oompa Loompas gender neutral.
Weren't they always gender neutral?
The wonderful words of Roald Dahl can transport you to different worlds and introduce you to the most marvelous characters. This book was rewritten many years ago, and so we regularly review the language to ensure that it can continue to be enjoyed today. Sure, without these Orwellian minders updating the lingo, could not be enjoyed by kids.
So the chick who ate the blueberry candy who exploded is no longer fat, but they're going to change that to enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And the Oompa Loompa are not small men, they're small people. Okay.
Yeah. Gender references have also been neutralized not to offend women or the transgender community. In The Witches, a section saying witches are bald beneath their wigs has a new disclaimer.
Yeah.
Quote, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that.
Oh, God.
It's like an episode of Seinfeld. Not that there's anything wrong with that. No, of course not. Disclaimer after every line in James the Giant Peach and Witches and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Matthew Dennison, who's a Roald Dahl biographer, said in the most muted tone you can say it, and the most muted critical tone you can say something that lodges disagreement. He's almost certain that Roald Dahl would have recognized the alterations to his novels prompted by the political climate were driven by adults rather than children. No, you don't say. Mm-hmm. So banning Dr. Seuss books, as a half a dozen were discontinued last year because of racist overtones, allegedly. And rewriting those that will stay in circulation, if they are to stay in circulation. Children's books. Got to get to the kids. And, of course, that is a perfect segue to our discussion with our next guest, which is the rewriting of history. It's not just for Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's also for Ken Burns, as Amity Shlaes writes in City Journal. Ken Burns, the famed documentarian, has a new documentary out about the Holocaust, which Amity took up. Amity Shlaes is board chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, winner of the Hayek Prize, and best-selling author of The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, and Great Society, A New History. Amity, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
So glad to be here.
So with the purge that continues of fictional literature that is oriented towards kids on up, we also have running on a parallel track the rewriting of American history, in large measure to cast the United States as the villain in most of the history that is attendant to its existence. And Ken Burns, you argue, is doing something along those lines in his new documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust.
Well, the U.S. and the Holocaust is worth paying attention to. It's over 360 minutes, Ken Burns special, and it's being disseminated to classrooms.
Of course.
So it's a course in addition to being a TV show. And as we know, school teachers get their culture from PBS. It's PBS. And what's very disappointing about it, it has a great treatment of the Holocaust. Yes, the Holocaust really happened. But the film effectively blames America for the Holocaust. We didn't do enough, so it's kind of our fault. By innuendo, I would add, and in very partisan fashion, that is, Republicans are responsible for the Holocaust, not Democrats.
Yeah.
Which is, and somehow Donald Trump is in there. Is that useful? So what we noticed at the Coolidge Foundation, which is a presidential history entity, was that the documentary finds Calvin Coolidge for signing a restriction of immigration in the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. Also, by the way, treats Hoover even worse. you can support immigration restriction without being a bigot. It's not necessarily an equal sign when you say, well, maybe America should have a pause now in immigration. That's effectively what Coolidge was saying by signing that act. And therefore, we restricted immigration in 1924 under a law. And this, in the Burns logic, which involves moving time and space in some creative ways, caused what went on in concentration camps in darkest Poland in 1942.
Well, how does Byrne connect those dots exactly?
With difficulty, but he has good pens, funded by every Jewish group I can think of, who are rightly concerned, these groups, of that America's forgetting the Holocaust. But what Burns does is says our restriction of immigration meant that foreigners, including European Jews, could not get into the U.S. a generation after we decided to restrict immigration. That kind of forgets the fact that German Jews in the 20s, by and large, could immigrate to the U.S. They chose not to. We're not blaming them. But the administration that didn't change the immigration policy happened to be the Roosevelt administration. Oh, well, that was a choice by President Roosevelt. The film is also hard on the State Department and the WASPs in it. That's sort of the way Burns has a thing against Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but because it seems he doesn't want to blame Roosevelt for in real time keeping the door shut. But one ends up watching this film, quite sympathetic to Roosevelt, who did choose to deal with the Holocaust in a rather costly way for the country, which is World War II. So the hundreds of thousands of Americans who went over there are kind of ignored because, we tried to end the Holocaust through a terrible sacrifice, joining Britain in the war. And we did, by the way. That is, we stopped the bad Germans from doing what they were doing in that time. But the suggestion in the film is we ought to have gone in, behind the lines with refugee rescuers and brought the poor people of Eastern Europe over to the States. That wasn't exactly possible. Auschwitz wasn't even in bombing range for a long time. There's a weird suggestion in this film that we might have bombed Auschwitz. Oh, great. We would have bombed the inmates as well as the Nazis. So there's a kind of self-righteous current logic informing this film. And because it's so long, there's no question schools are going to use this material for decades and over weeks in courses. What I say in conclusion, and is that the argument is so twisted and so shaming, so much assigning blame to the U.S. that kids are just not going to remember the Holocaust at all. Who wants to be told they're bad and something that happened in 1940 is their fault? Not even Germans, right? So how can American kids accept that? And it's all conflated with American racism. We were racist. We signed on to eugenics. We forcibly sterilized poor young ladies and men. We did that. It's true. Our states did that. We regret it. It was wrong. It has nothing to do with what the Nazis did, really. The Nazis were an insane version.
Well, of course. But, it's interesting, too. The eugenics that still goes on in this country. There's legitimate issues to elevate and discuss what the U.S. could have done and so on and so forth, what the options were. Did they make the right choice? That's all part of discussing history, and that's all well and good. And there are some, and we're hardly, we're just a bunch of sinners like everybody else all over the world. We do terrible things to ourselves and other people too, and have. But for all of the hand-wringing about eugenics, I wonder what Ken Burns would say about the Buck v. Bell decision, which has not been overturned by the Supreme Court, just by Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Oh well,
there are 31 states in the country today that still have forcible sterilization laws on the books for people with disabilities.
Absolutely. Life is complicated, and you have to look at life in the period that you're describing. The eugenics movement was very unfortunate. By the way, it was mostly led by progressives, and it needs to be changed.
Margaret Sanger.
Every statute needs to be gone. It isn't, but the impulse, and why am I even paying attention to this? It's a good question. But I think it's because we, America, at the end of the Great Society, into the Nixon years, created PBS and gave partisan progressivism this tremendous platform. And there is no contrary other side or common sense version of what happened in the 20s and the 30s here. By and large, the U.S. is not a murderously racist country. We had lynching. It diminished, for example, in the 20s, the Coolidge period, which burned so slimes. He also blames Hoover for deporting millions, or makes the suggestion, a lot of it's by innuendo, that Hoover deported millions of Mexicans back to Mexico. Some, maybe in the hundreds of thousands, Mexicans did return to Mexico. It's not clear why or how, but it's pretty clear that if anyone did it, that is, some of them were volunteers, it was states and localities, by and large, with minimal intervention from the federal government. So what the film does effectively is say, Coolidge bad, racist, Hoover bad, racist. Anyone but Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt bad, racist. And to tell kids that is very offensive. And I'm not clear why we've given PBS, why we created PBS when I see these things, as much as we love it. And a lot of us love Ken Burns. His Huey Long documentary early is fabulous. And I recommend it to everyone, but he's out of control with this show.
His documentary on baseball is good too, but he's a man of the left, and so this is what you're going to get as well, particularly when he wants to be considered like a serious man of the left, and he's and wants to use, and is probably under pressure to use his standing to advance their hatred of America, frankly. I don't know how else to say it, because, I look for a forthcoming documentary from Ken Burns about how the Clinton administration was racist for not intervening in the Rwandan genocide, or the Biden administration for not scrambling our resources to evac the Uyghur Muslims from China. I mean, you can play this out over all sorts of atrocities committed the world over under every presidential regime since the nation's founding. And so it seems to me it's a little bit of cherry picking in terms of any real understanding of the limitations of American power, the decision making that goes into when to intervene in another country's affairs, and so forth.
It's a disingenuous feel-good sanctimony. You save the earth if you recycle appropriately. Or, you save the earth if you show disrespect to previous presidents. What Coolidge did, because it's President's Day, I'll say, and I went into this project as chairman of the Coolidge Foundation. Coolidge, if he were a stock, he'd be a buy. He's a low ranker. What Coolidge did was he said, I'm going to build up the U.S. so it can be a model of freedom, a light in the world, city on a hill. And he actually did that. That is, he helped immigrant Americans in America, and there were plenty at that time, to find their way, to get jobs, to go to graduate school, to invent things, and become prosperous. So why trash him? I mean, if you go back and look at Coolidge's speeches, he very much admired, for example, Jews. There's a wonderful speech he gave where he said to the Jewish community, philanthropic community, the same one that's funding Ken Burns, I want you to know I feel you are making good citizens. You are building hospitals. You are taking care of poor people. I respect you and your contribution in the country. And he did that for every ethnic group. So why say into the garbage pail with these past presidents? I'm waiting for the Hoover lobby and Margaret Hoover, the heroine descendant, to defend Hoover, who's trashed worse because he has a millions word attached to his name in this show. But even the Rooseveltians should stand up and say, well, look, Roosevelt did call us to sacrifice to save Europe, and we did, and he did. But instead it's a sour bitterness about our own imperfections, and that's no way to teach little kids history, or big kids, or adults.
Speaking of polluting a brand, Margaret Hoover as the host of Firing Line on PBS. Oh my goodness, what a commentary that is on the descent in intellectual heft at PBS and everywhere else in this culture, from William F. Buckley to Margaret Hoover. Good grief.
Well, I'm not going to trash Margaret.
I will.
I think she's fabulous. I think she's fabulous. But consistent. Your point is that their consistent, high quality discussion, full of substance, is really rare. And it's almost like the non-left is silenced on it. You have to be either furious and angry, or you don't get to speak because you're a boring professor. So if you're not a left-leaning progressive, and that's a problem. When we had a Coolidge conference this week with the Library of Congress, God bless them, our partner, and we had real substance. We spent a whole hour on the tax treatment of capital gains in the 1920s, which, by the way, was saved by the Harding administration, another president who needs revision. They were going to treat capital gains, which is a very important tax for any business and any family investing, as ordinary income. And the ordinary income tax was over 50%. And the administration came along and said, no, it's going to be 12.5%, that rate, which is, by the way, lower than the cap gains rates today. And Congress went along, and that made Henry Ford more possible, made the expansion of Henry Ford, not just the assembly line, but also the cap gains rate. The capital gains tax rate matters to business, and quite a bit. So we had an hour with a fellow named Jim Lucier, who looked into it for us, a tax expert, on that kind of discussion where you're talking actually about legislation rather than blaming other people on the air is almost not allowed nowadays, which means younger people are deprived of data points and of a model of logical thought.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, it's a different era. We have perfect people in charge these days, unlike we did a century ago. That's the difference. Amity Shlaes, board chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, winner of the Hayek Prize, and best-selling author of both The Forgotten Man as well as Great Society, A New History. Amity, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on President's Day, friend.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer. Did the product